The stage lights glowed as the host announced, "From Cebu, Philippines, please welcome our next act." An elderly man stepped forward, holding the hand of his teenage son. His back was slightly bent, his gray hair uncombed, and his shoes looked worn from years of walking. The audience exchanged smirks and whispered to each other. Some laughed, assuming this would be nothing more than an embarrassing audition. The old man moved slowly, almost trembling, but with dignity in every step. He didn't dress like a performer, his shirt was faded, his trousers too big, and his smile too humble. Behind him, his son followed quietly, his eyes shining with both nervousness and trust. The contrast was striking, an old father and a young boy facing the biggest stage in the world, while thousands of strangers doubted them. One camera panned across the judges' table. Simon Cowell leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "This better be good." Another judge whispered something to her neighbor, her expression full of uncertainty. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some even chuckled openly, shaking their heads before the act even began. Yet, in the middle of that storm of judgment, the old man did something powerful. He gently squeezed his son's hand, looked into his eyes, and smiled, a smile not of fear, but of strength. He then leaned into the microphone and introduced himself with a soft, accented voice. "My name is Ramon, and this is my son, Mateo." The words didn't silence the crowd. If anything, some audience members laughed again, unimpressed by the simplicity of the introduction. But what happened next changed everything. The father took a deep breath, his hand never leaving his son's, and explained, "We came here not just to sing, but to share something that comes from the heart." At that moment, the laughter began to die down. Something about the way he spoke, so steady, so filled with love, demanded attention. The boy, though shy, stood taller beside his father, his quiet presence radiating courage. The lights dimmed, the stage set for their performance. For the first time, silence replaced the whispers and giggles. The very people who mocked them now leaned forward, their curiosity overtaking their doubt. In that silence, the old man and his son were no longer strangers to be ridiculed. They became a story waiting to unfold. As the lights softened and the music crew prepared, the camera zoomed in on the boy. He couldn't have been more than 14, his features delicate yet marked with quiet determination. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes, deep, expressive, unafraid, told the real story. The host leaned forward curiously. "Mateo, are you ready?" he asked, but the boy did not answer. Instead, he turned to his father, watching his lips move, reading the words with precision. It was then that the audience realized something extraordinary. Mateo could not hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the judges leaned forward in shock. The old man stepped closer to the microphone, his voice heavy but full of pride. "My son, he was born deaf," he said slowly, his accent carrying the weight of years of struggle. "But he has never let that stop him. He does not hear music, he feels it here." He tapped his chest over his heart. The theater, which only moments ago had been filled with murmurs and laughter, suddenly grew still. Parents in the crowd pulled their children closer. Strangers wiped tears from their eyes, already touched before a single note was sung. What had begun as a doubtful audition now carried the weight of a miracle waiting to happen. Mateo looked out at the sea of faces, some still skeptical, others moved. His hands brushed against the microphone stand as if to steady himself. He closed his eyes. For him, silence was not emptiness, it was his world. Yet through that silence, he had discovered a different kind of music, one that flowed from vibrations, from rhythm, from the pulse of his own heartbeat. His father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered into his ear, not words, but encouragement through touch. It was their secret language, built over years of trial and love. Mateo nodded, his chest rising with determination. The judges exchanged glances. Could a boy who had never heard a single melody truly sing before millions? Doubt still lingered in their eyes, but the air inside the theater was charged with expectation. And then, just before the music began, Mateo opened his eyes. They were no longer trembling with nerves but glowing with something else, courage. The silence that had once been filled with mockery was now sacred. The audience wasn't just waiting for a performance, they were waiting for a miracle. The first note of the instrumental track floated through the theater. It was soft, almost hesitant, as though the music itself understood the weight of the moment. Mateo stood motionless, his eyes shut tightly. The world around him was silent, as it had always been, but the vibrations in the floor beneath his feet told him the rhythm had begun. His father, Ramon, gave a gentle squeeze on his hand, 3 taps, their private signal that it was time. Mateo lifted the microphone with trembling fingers. For a second, the audience thought he might freeze. But then, with a deep breath, he opened his mouth. The first sound that left him was not just a voice, it was a revelation. Clear, angelic, and hauntingly powerful, Mateo's singing seemed to rise from somewhere beyond the physical world. It was raw, unpolished, yet breathtakingly pure, as though every word carried the echo of his soul. The audience gasped in unison. Judges who had prepared themselves for disappointment suddenly leaned forward, their faces transforming from doubt to awe. Ramon stood just a few feet away, his eyes never leaving his son. He gave subtle gestures, raising his eyebrows, nodding softly, tapping his hand in rhythm against his chest, each one a silent guide to keep Mateo in tune with the melody he could not hear. The boy followed every signal flawlessly, his voice soaring higher with every note. At that moment, silence no longer defined Mateo. The theater, once skeptical, now seemed suspended in his world. Every lyric rang out like a miracle, each note shaking the hearts of those listening. Simon Cowell, known for his stern and often brutal critiques, sat completely still, his lips parted in disbelief. Whispering almost to himself, he muttered, This is unbelievable." By the second verse, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Tears streamed down faces in the crowd. Some people held their hands over their mouths, as though afraid to breathe and break the spell. Even the cameras seemed to linger longer on Mateo's face, capturing every ounce of emotion he poured into the song. As he reached the final chorus, his voice cracked slightly, not from weakness but from the overwhelming emotion he carried. Ramon quickly nodded, signaling strength, and the boy pushed through, delivering the last note with a power that echoed through the theater like thunder. When the music stopped, silence followed. Not the silence of mockery, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of a crowd too moved to speak. And then, like a wave breaking, the audience erupted. Mateo had done the impossible. For a heartbeat, the theater was frozen. The last note still lingered in the air, and Mateo stood there with his eyes closed, clutching the microphone as though afraid to let go. Then, as if a dam had burst, the entire auditorium exploded into applause. The crowd rose to their feet in one massive standing ovation. People were shouting, clapping, and stomping so hard that the stage itself seemed to vibrate. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the miracle they had just witnessed. The same people who had laughed when the old man and his son walked on stage were now crying, screaming Mateo's name, desperate to honor what they had seen. The judges' reactions were just as powerful. Heidi covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes shining with tears. Howie stood and clapped above his head, his expression one of pure amazement. Even Sophia, who had looked doubtful at first, leaned forward with her chin in her hands, whispering, "Incredible, just incredible." But the most shocking reaction came from Simon Cowell. The man known worldwide for his icy critiques and brutal honesty was visibly shaken. He blinked several times, his eyes glistening, before standing slowly and joining the ovation. His lips curled into a smile, small, but genuine, the kind he reserved for moments that were beyond talent, moments that were history. On stage, Ramon pulled his son into a tight embrace. Mateo's chest heaved as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. He couldn't hear the thunderous applause, but he could feel it. The vibrations shook through the stage and into his body, wrapping him in the energy of thousands of voices cheering for him. Ramon whispered into his son's ear, not words, but encouragement, pressing his cheek against Mateo's with a pride too deep for language. Golden spotlights swept over the theater, capturing the faces of audience members who were still wiping away tears. Children in the crowd pointed at Mateo with wide eyes, as if they were witnessing a superhero. Parents clutched their kids tightly, silently grateful for the reminder that love and perseverance could break any barrier. The applause didn't die down, it grew louder, rolling like thunder. It wasn't just appreciation for a song, it was gratitude for a miracle, a boy who had shown them that silence could produce the most beautiful sound. And just when it seemed the moment couldn't grow any more powerful, one of the judges reached forward toward the golden buzzer. The story was about to reach its climax. The roar of the crowd had not faded when the spotlight shifted back to the judges' table. All eyes were on Simon Cowell. He sat for a long moment, his hand resting under his chin, staring at the boy who had just stunned the world. Then, without warning, Simon pushed back his chair and stood. The crowd gasped. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Simon looked directly at Mateo, his voice low but filled with emotion. Mateo, you've just done something I will never forget for the rest of my life. You can't hear a single note, but you made every single one of us feel music tonight. That is not talent, that is a gift. The audience screamed in anticipation, and then, with one swift motion, Simon slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. The theater erupted into chaos. Golden confetti burst from above, cascading down like a shower of dreams. It glittered in the stage lights, swirling around Mateo and his father in a golden storm. The audience screamed so loudly it felt like the roof might collapse. Mateo's eyes widened as the golden paper fell onto his skin. He could not hear the deafening cheers, but he could feel everything, the confetti brushing against his face, the stage shaking with stomping feet, the energy of thousands of hearts pounding for him. He stretched his arms wide, smiling through tears, letting the golden rain fall into his palms as if catching proof of his miracle. Ramon, overcome with emotion, dropped to his knees, holding his son close. Tears streamed down the old man's face as he whispered into Mateo's ear, not with sound, but with love. The boy nodded, pressing his forehead against his father's, both of them trembling with joy. The judges stood, clapping above their heads. Heidi was openly sobbing. Sophia wiped tears from her cheeks. Howie shouted over the noise, "This is why we have this show. This is why we're here." But it was Simon who walked onto the stage, breaking all protocol. He stepped forward, brushed confetti from Mateo's shoulder, and whispered something only the boy and his father could see from his lips, "You've changed the world tonight." The crowd didn't stop cheering. Confetti kept falling. The old man and his deaf son stood in the center of it all, not just contestants, but symbols of hope. It was more than a performance. It was a miracle written in gold.